I drove up to my mountain cabin to close it before winter set in. All I expected was cold pipes and a quiet afternoon. But when I came around that last bend and saw an unfamiliar truck parked in front of my porch, something deep in my chest went very still. I moved closer just enough to see through the window. My son was inside, with a woman who was not his wife. He never saw me. I turned around, walked back to my truck, and made a phone call. Not to my son's wife, to the other woman's husband. Before we go further, I want to say I'm genuinely grateful you're here. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country? Let's see how far this story travels. One small note. Certain details have been crafted for narrative purposes, and any resemblance to real names or locations is coincidental. But the lesson this story carries is absolutely real. My father built the cabin in 1961 with money he had saved for 11 years, working at a lumber mill outside of Asheville. He did most of the work himself, driving up on weekends with two of his brothers and a truck full of materials. By the time he was done, it was a simple structure: 1 story, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace that drew well even in the worst weather. He was proud of it in the quiet way that men of his generation were proud of things they built with their own hands. He did not talk about it much. He just kept it up year after year, the way you keep up something that matters. My mother spent every summer of her adult life in that cabin. She painted watercolors on the back porch and read paperback novels and grew tomatoes in a small garden patch along the south wall that never produced as well as she hoped, but that she tended faithfully anyway. When my father passed, she kept going back until she could not make the drive anymore. The cabin went to me after that, the way things go to the one child who is likely to take care of them. My wife Helen loved it from the first summer I brought her up. She said it felt like a place that had already decided what it was and was not interested in being anything else. That was her way of saying she approved. Helen had a gift for finding the exact right words, for things, a gift I never had and always admired in her. We spent 22 summers in that cabin together. We taught our son Julian to fish on the lake out back when he was 5 years old. We watched thunderstorms roll in over the ridge from the back porch with glasses of wine and no particular place to be. When Helen got sick, we came up one last time the summer before she passed. She wanted to hear the loons out on the water one more time, she said. We sat on the porch until well after dark that night listening. She has been gone for 6 years now. After she passed, I kept going back to the cabin the way some men go back to church. Not because it fixed anything. Nothing fixes the particular silence that a good marriage leaves behind when it ends. But the cabin was the place where she had been most herself, and being there made the silence feel less like absence and more like something I could carry. I retired from the bench 4 years ago after 35 years as a criminal court judge in Buncombe County. People ask me sometimes what I miss about it. I tell them I miss the cases that were not straightforward, the ones where the truth was buried under several layers of other people's interests, and you had to be patient enough to wait for it to surface. I do not tell them that I also miss having somewhere to be every morning. Retirement is a strange country, and I am still finding my way around it. That October Tuesday, I loaded my truck the same way I had loaded it every October for as long as I could remember. Thermos of good coffee. The sandwich my neighbor Rita had made the night before and left in a paper bag on my porch with a note that said, "Drive safe." A toolbox in the bed of the truck, because there was always something that needed fixing. A canvas bag with work gloves and extra rope for pulling the dock. I was on the road before 7 in the morning. The drive from Asheville takes about 2 hours once you get up into the mountains, and I had the windows cracked because the air at that elevation in October has a particular quality to it that I have never been able to describe exactly, but that I look forward to every year. I was not thinking about anything complicated that morning. I was thinking about whether the dock bracket had rusted through over the summer the way it had threatened to last spring. I was thinking about the sandwich in the passenger seat and whether I should eat it before I started work or after. I was thinking about the way the light would be sitting on the water when I came through the trees. I came around the last bend before the clearing, and I saw the truck, black Ford F-150, brand new, parked in front of my porch with the kind of easy confidence that belongs only to a vehicle whose driver has no doubt about their right to be exactly where they are. I let my foot off the gas and coasted to a stop in the middle of the road. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, and I looked at that truck for a long time without moving. My mind was already doing the thing it had done for 35 years without my permission, cataloging, sorting, asking questions in a particular order. Whose truck? Why here? Why now? Why no phone call? My son Julian drove a silver Jeep Cherokee. His wife Clara drove a white Honda Civic. My nearest neighbor on this road was a retired schoolteacher named Howard, who lived a half-mile back toward the highway and who had not been well enough to make the drive up in 2 years. I did not recognize that truck. I sat there in the October quiet with the engine ticking and the hemlocks pressing in on both sides of the road, and I felt something shift in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. I took out my phone. I took a picture of the license plate, Tennessee plate. I did it without thinking about why the way you do things that 35 years of watching evidence disappear has made automatic. Then I got out of my truck slowly, because my hip had been bothering me since the cold set in, and I stood in the road, and I looked at the cabin, and I listened. And that was when I heard it, a laugh. My son laughed. I had not heard Julian laugh like that in years. Easy, unguarded, the kind of laugh that belongs to a man who has forgotten to be careful. My chest tightened the moment I recognized it. A slow, terrible squeeze that started somewhere behind my sternum and did not let go. I moved toward the cabin on instinct, my boots quiet on the soft dirt. The kitchen window faced the side yard, and the blinds were halfway down the slats, angled open just enough. I pressed myself against the cedar siding and looked through the gap. Julian was sitting at my kitchen table. My table. The one my father had built from a single slab of walnut in 1964. He was leaning back in the chair with a glass of my whiskey in his hand, grinning at something the woman across from him had just said. The woman was not Clara. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered, and striking with sun-darkened skin and thick blonde hair pulled back loosely. She wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and she was laughing too, her whole body leaning toward my son, the way a woman leans toward a man she has been leaning toward for a long time. "You are absolutely terrible," she said, still laughing, reaching across to swat his arm. "You know that, you keep coming back anyway," Julian said, catching her hand and holding it. She smiled at him, slow and warm. "I do, don't I?" He reached up with his free hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so practiced, so achingly familiar, that my stomach turned over. Then he pulled her toward him, and she leaned down, and they kissed. Not a quick kiss. Not the kiss of two people who were still discovering each other. It was the unhurried, comfortable kiss of two people who had been doing this for a long time and intended to keep doing it. My legs stopped working. I grabbed the cedar siding with both hands to keep from going down my knuckles, white against the weathered wood. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. For one terrible second, the world tilted sideways, and I genuinely could not tell if I was about to fall or about to be sick, or both. Inside, Julian laughed again at something she whispered, a low, delighted sound. A sound I had never once heard him make around Clara. My eyes burned. Not tears, not yet something hotter than tears. Something that started in my chest and pushed outward until my whole body felt like it was running a fever. I had spent 35 years in a courtroom watching people lie and cheat and destroy the lives of the people closest to them. I had thought I was past being shocked by what human beings were capable of doing to each other. I was wrong. I made myself let go of the wall. I made myself breathe, and I walked away. I walked back to my truck, with my hands balled into fists at my sides, and my jaw clenched so tight my back teeth ached. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to go back up those porch steps and throw that door open and demand to know what in God's name my son thought he was doing in my cabin at my table with another woman while his wife was home raising their daughter. I wanted to yell. I wanted to put my fist through something. I wanted Julian to look me in the eye and explain himself. I kept walking. I got in my truck, and I drove a quarter-mile down the gravel road to the boat launch turnout, where the hemlocks were thick enough to hide a vehicle. I pulled in, cut the engine, and sat there with both hands still on the wheel and my heart still hammering, and the sandwich Rita had packed sitting untouched on the passenger seat. 10 minutes. I gave myself exactly 10 minutes. I had watched men destroy everything they were trying to protect by acting on the first feeling that hit them. Good men. Decent men. Men who walked into rooms at the wrong moment and said the wrong things and handed the other side exactly what they needed to win. I had watched it happen so many times from the bench that it had stopped surprising me. Emotion was the enemy of outcome. That was not a comfortable truth, but it was the only one that mattered right now. When the 10 minutes were up, I opened the glove compartment. I had kept a small digital camera in there for years, ever since a dispute with my insurance company over storm damage that had cost me $3,000 because I had trusted phone photographs instead of a proper lens. Old habit. Next to it was a handheld voice recorder I had carried since my first year on the bench, back when I still dictated notes to myself during the drive home. I checked both batteries. Both good. I clipped the recorder to my belt under my jacket and turned it on. Then I got out of the truck and I went back through the woods. There is a deer trail that runs along the ridge behind the cabin, about 40 yards above the tree line, before it drops down toward the water. I had walked that trail every season for 30 years, and I knew it the way I knew my own kitchen, every exposed root, every place where the ground went soft near the creek. Run off every gap in the underbrush, where you had to turn sideways to get through without making noise. I moved slowly. My hip was complaining, and the cold had settled into my lower back, but I kept moving. I came up behind the woodshed on the north side of the cabin. From there, I had a clear line of sight to the back deck where Helen and I had eaten 100 dinners watching the sun go down over the water. The lake my father had taught me to fish on when I was 7 years old. The same dock I had taught Julian to cast from when he was 5. Julian and Victoria had moved outside. They were sitting together on the old wooden bench along the back railing, the one I had built myself 20 years ago from leftover cedar planks. He had his arm around her shoulders, and she was leaning into his side with the easy comfort of a woman who had found her favorite place in the world and had no intention of leaving it. They were drinking my whiskey, talking quietly, laughing at things I could not hear from where I was crouched behind the woodshed, with pine needles pressing into my knees and a hornet investigating my left hand with uncomfortable thoroughness. I did not move. I raised the camera, and I started taking pictures. I took pictures of his arm around her shoulders. I took pictures of her leaning into his chest. I took pictures of him refilling her glass with that particular brand of attentiveness that men reserve for women they are trying to impress or trying to keep. I zoomed in on his face, on hers, on the way she tilted her head back when she laughed, and the way he watched her do it, like it was something he never got tired of seeing. "I keep thinking about Gatlinburg," she said at one point loud enough that I caught it. "That little place on the river." "We'll go back," Julian said. He said it the way a man says something he has said before and means to keep saying. "Spring, maybe, when things settle down a little." "Things never settle down," Victoria said, but she was smiling when she said it, leaning up to press her lips to the side of his jaw. My finger kept pressing the shutter. My chest kept burning. And somewhere beneath the burning, something cold and methodical and 35 years old was already taking notes. I stayed behind that woodshed for 1 hour and 57 minutes. My legs cramped twice. My back went from complaining to something closer to genuine protest. At one point I shifted my weight, and my boot snapped a twig, and I went completely still for 30 seconds, while a squirrel in the hemlock above me did the same. I had never been more patient in my life. Because what was burning in my chest was not just grief, and it was not just rage. It was something that needed to be aimed correctly before it was allowed to move. And I was not going to waste it on a scene in a cabin that would be forgotten in a week. I was going to aim it like a man who had spent 35 years learning exactly where to point. I waited until they went back inside. Then I lowered the camera, straightened up slowly, and stood in the cold October air for a moment, with my hand pressed flat against the woodshed wall. The lake was absolutely still. Somewhere out on the water, a loon called once and went quiet. I turned and walked back through the trees. I heard the Ford's engine turn over from somewhere in the trees above the trail. The sound carried clean and sharp through the cold October air, the way sounds do in the mountains, when the leaves are mostly down, and there is nothing left to absorb them. I heard the tires crunch over the gravel, slow at first, then picking up as the truck reached the main road. I heard it until I could not hear it anymore. Then I heard a second engine, Julian's Jeep, starting up, rolling out, fading in the same direction. I stood behind the woodshed and I counted to 500, slowly. One number at a time, the way I used to count during the worst moments on the bench when I needed my face to stay still while something terrible was being said in my courtroom. When I reached 500, I counted another 100, just to be certain. Then I walked up to the cabin and let myself in with my own key. The kitchen stopped me first. It looked exactly as it always looked. The dish towel hung straight on the oven handle. The 2 chairs were pushed in evenly at the table. My bottle of Blanton's sat on top of the refrigerator exactly where I kept it, the wax seal facing forward, the little jockey on top pointing due east the way he always did. If I had walked in 10 minutes earlier without knowing anything, I would have walked straight through to the back porch and never suspected a thing. That was perhaps the detail that hit me hardest right then, harder even than the photographs on my camera. Not what they had done, but how well they had practiced hiding it. My throat tightened until swallowing hurt. I checked the living room. The throw pillows on the couch were arranged with a precision that Helen would have appreciated and that I had never once managed on my own. The coffee table was clean. The fireplace grate was cold and undisturbed. I went upstairs. There were 2 bedrooms on the upper floor. The first was the guest room Helen and I had used for friends who came up in summer. The second was smaller, tucked under the slope of the roof on the north side with a window that looked out over the water. That was Lily's room. My granddaughter had claimed it the first Christmas after she was born, when Julian and Clara had brought her up bundled in so many layers. She looked like a small, extremely serious snowball. She had been sleeping in that room every Christmas Eve since she was old enough to ask for it by name. She kept a box of crayons in the nightstand drawer and a stuffed rabbit named Gerald on the pillow, and she called the cabin her favorite place in the whole entire world, which she announced every single visit with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to hedge her opinions. I pushed the door open. The rabbit was still on the pillow. The crayon box was still in the drawer. I could see the corner of it sticking out. But the comforter was wrong. Pulled too tight on the left side loose and bunched on the right the way it looks when someone has made a bed quickly and without much care for the result. And the pillow on the right side, Lily's pillow, the one with the small yellow stars on the pillowcase that Clara had bought at a craft fair in Weaverville 2 summers ago, had been moved. Not far. Just enough. I stepped into the room and I looked down at that pillow. There was a single hair on the pillowcase. Long, blonde, catching the gray afternoon light from the window like a thread of something that had no business being there. My legs gave, not all the way. I caught myself on the doorframe with one hand, my fingers digging into the wood hard enough to hurt, and I stood there, bent slightly at the waist, with my forehead almost touching the frame, and my eyes burning so badly I had to squeeze them shut. A sound came out of me that I did not recognize, something low and broken that I had not heard from myself since the night Helen died, and I pressed my free hand over my mouth to stop it from happening again. Lily had drawn pictures of this lake with those crayons. She had pressed her small face against that window on cold mornings to watch the deer come down to the water. She had asked me last Christmas with those wide, serious eyes she got from her mother whether the loons went somewhere warm in winter or whether they stayed and just got very, very cold. And her own father had brought a stranger into this room, into this bed, into the place where my granddaughter kept her rabbit and her crayons and her absolute certainty that the world was essentially a good and trustworthy place. I straightened up. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I took one more look at that pillow, and I made myself a promise that I kept my mouth shut about for the next 3 weeks. Then I went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table in the chair I had sat in for 30 years, and I put my hands flat on the walnut surface my father had made, and I looked up at the clock on the wall. The same clock my father had hung in this kitchen in 1968. The second hand swept around with the same steady indifference it had always had. I watched it for exactly 1 minute. When the minute was up, I stood, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I had not called in 2 years. Thomas Doyle picked up on the third ring the way he always had, like a man who kept his phone close, but refused to seem eager about it. Doyle. Just the one word. Flat and professional, and exactly what I needed to hear right then. "It's Arthur Sterling," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I need your help with something." A pause. Not a long one. Doyle and I had worked the same circuit for the better part of 2 decades, him building cases from the ground up and me deciding what to do with them once they landed in my courtroom. He had sat across from me in enough difficult conversations to know that when I called him out of the blue after 2 years of nothing, I was not calling about the weather. "What kind of something?" he said. "The personal kind," I said. "Family." Another pause, shorter this time. "Talk to me." I gave him the plate number first. Tennessee registration, black Ford F-150, current model year by the look of it. Then I gave him a physical description of the woman I had seen through the kitchen window. Mid-40s, blonde, broad-shouldered, a contractor's build, the kind of woman who spent more time on job sites than in offices. I told him she drove the Ford herself, that she had been at my cabin with my son, and that I needed to know everything about her before I took another step. "And timeline," Doyle said. "As fast as you can manage without cutting corners." "Understood." I heard him writing. Old habit. Doyle had never trusted digital notes, and I had always respected him for it. "You doing all right, Arthur?" The question caught me somewhere I was not prepared for. My jaw tightened. I looked at the clock on the wall, the same clock my father had hung 55 years ago, and I watched the second hand make one full sweep before I answered. "No," I said. "But I will be. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon," he said. And that was that. I hung up the phone and sat at the table for another few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting my hands rest on the walnut surface and my eyes stay on the window above the sink. The light outside had gone thin and gray. The lake was barely visible through the tree line, just a flat silver glint between the dark shapes of the hemlocks. I made myself a sandwich from the supplies I had brought, sat back down, and ate it without tasting any of it. Then I packed up, locked the cabin, and drove home. The 2 hours back to Asheville were the longest 2 hours I could remember since Helen's last night in the hospital. I had the radio off. I had the windows up. The mountains rolled past in the early dark, and I held the wheel at 10 and 2 and kept my speed exactly 5 miles over the limit the way I always did. And twice I had to pull onto the shoulder because my hands were shaking badly enough that I did not trust them. I did not cry. I was not sure yet what I was feeling well enough to know whether crying was the appropriate response. What I felt was something larger and more shapeless than grief, something that had grief in it and rage in it, and a particular cold clarity that I recognized from the worst days on the bench, the days when the evidence in front of you was so unambiguous that the only question left was how much damage had already been done and how much could still be prevented. I kept driving. I got home a little after 8 in the evening. The house was quiet the way it is always quiet now, a quality of silence that has texture to it, that pushes back slightly when you walk into it. I turned on the lights in the kitchen and the office and left the rest of the house dark. I made coffee I did not particularly want and carried it to my desk and sat down. My legal pad was where it always was, top right corner of the desk, next to the pen cup Helen had given me the Christmas before she got sick. I pulled the pad toward me and I started writing. Not in any particular order at first, just getting it down. What I had seen. What I had heard. What the photographs on my camera would show. What Doyle might find. What the possible explanations were, beginning with the most charitable and working toward the one I already knew was true. By the time I had filled 3 pages, the coffee was cold, and the clock on the wall read 11:47. I looked at what I had written for a long time. Then I drew a line under it all and wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page. Clara. Lily. Those 2 words sat there on the yellow paper under the desk lamp, and they did not move, and they did not ask me anything. They just waited the way the truth always waits, patient and immovable for the person who has to carry it to figure out how. I closed the pad. I turned off the desk lamp. I went to bed, and I lay in the dark for a very long time before anything close to sleep found me. Tomorrow Doyle would call, and then I would know what I was actually dealing with. Doyle called at 2:17 the following afternoon, which meant he had started working the moment we hung up and had not stopped. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang, staring at a cup of coffee I had poured 40 minutes ago and never touched. I picked up before the second ring. "Talk to me," I said. "Her name is Victoria Vance," Doyle said. 46 years old, lives in Maryville, Tennessee, about 50 miles southwest of Knoxville. Runs a small construction company out of their residential work, mostly high-end remodels and additions. She has been in business for about 8 years. I pulled out the legal pad and uncapped my pen. "Go on." "She is married," Doyle said. "Husband's name is Raymond Vance, 43 years old. Works as a registered nurse at Blount Memorial Hospital. Cardiac floor. By all accounts, he puts in somewhere between 55 and 60 hours a week." A brief pause. "They have 2 kids. Boy is 16, girl is 13. My pen stopped moving. I set it down on the legal pad and pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen counter because my legs had started doing something unreliable. Raymond Vance, 43 years old, working 60 hours a week on a cardiac floor while his wife drove a brand new Ford F-150 up to my cabin to drink my whiskey and laugh at my kitchen table with my son. "Arthur," Doyle said. "I'm here," I said. "Keep going." "The construction company is in trouble," Doyle said. "Has been for about 2.5 years. She is leveraged on her equipment behind on 2 subcontractor accounts, and her primary materials supplier filed a mechanics lien against her in August. My read is she is maybe 6 months from having to close the doors if nothing changes." I picked the pen back up. My hand was not entirely steady, but it was steady enough. "One more thing," Doyle said, and something in his tone made me go very still. "The truck, the F-150, it was purchased 14 months ago, cash purchase paid in full, $62,000. The kitchen went quiet around me in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "Her company was hemorrhaging money 14 months ago," I said. It was not a question. "Yes, it was," Doyle said. I stood at my kitchen counter, and I stared at the legal pad, and I felt something cold move through me from the top of my skull straight down to the soles of my feet. Not anger. Not yet. Something more precise than anger. The specific nauseating clarity of a man who has just watched a shape he did not recognize resolve itself into something he knows all too well. Victoria Vance. I said again, mostly to myself. I turned the name over in my mind the way you turn over a rock you have just found in your garden, not sure yet what is living underneath it. And then something shifted. Victoria, a contractor, residential remodels. Maryville, Tennessee, close enough to Asheville to make the drive without it being remarkable. "Doyle," I said slowly, "can you tell me whether her company has done any work in Asheville in the past 2 to 3 years? I heard him typing. A pause of about 40 seconds that felt considerably longer. 3 jobs in the Asheville area in the past 30 months, he said. 2 in Weaverville, 1 in the city proper. The city job was on Cavendish Street. Residential townhouse. Bathroom renovation. Permit pulled about 26 months ago. Job ran for approximately 3 weeks. My son and Clara lived on Cavendish Street. I put the phone down on the counter without hanging up, and I stood there with both hands braced on the edge of the sink, and I stared out the window at the dogwood tree in my backyard that Helen had planted the spring before Lily was born. The leaves were almost entirely down now, just a few brown ones hanging on at the tips of the branches, trembling in the October wind. 26 months ago. Clara had hired a contractor to redo their bathroom while Julian was working from home between projects. I remembered now. I remembered Clara telling me about the dust, how she had been bringing Lily over to my house in the afternoons to get away from the noise. I remembered thinking it was a bigger project than a bathroom needed to be. 3 weeks of workers in a townhouse that size. 3 weeks of Julian at home. 3 weeks of Victoria Vance in the house. My stomach turned over so hard, I had to grip the edge of the sink with both hands and breathe through my nose until it passed. Because I was doing the math now, and the math was not complicated. 26 months ago. And Doyle had said the affair, or whatever this was, had been going on for 2 to 2.5 years. It had started in their home. In the house where Clara made breakfast every morning and put Lily to bed every night and trusted that the walls around her family meant something. I picked the phone back up. "Doyle," I said. "Still here," he said quietly. "I need you to go deeper," I said. "Phone records if you can get them. Credit cards, hotel receipts, bank statements. I need to know everything, and I need it to be airtight, whatever it costs. How much time do I have?" Take what you need, I said. But don't take longer than you have to. Understood, he said. Arthur, you doing all right? I looked at the dogwood tree in the yard. I thought about Clara bringing Lily to my house to escape the dust. I thought about my daughter-in-law, 32 years old, a woman who graded papers at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night and packed Julian's lunch every morning and had never once in 11 years given me a single reason to doubt her. No, I said. But I'm going to make sure everyone else is. What Doyle had uncovered went far deeper than Arthur had imagined. Before I show you exactly what was in that manila envelope, drop a 7 in the comments and let me know you're still here. One quick note before we continue. Parts of this story contain fictional elements woven in for depth and reflection. You're welcome to step away now if that's not your thing. But if you stay, I promise it's worth it. 3 weeks is a long time to know something is wrong and not be able to do anything about it yet. I saw Julian twice during those 3 weeks. Once at his house for Sunday dinner, where he sat across the table from Clara and helped Lily cut her chicken into smaller pieces and asked me about the cabin winterization with an easiness that made my back teeth ache. Once at a hardware store on Merriman Avenue where we ran into each other by accident and talked for 10 minutes about nothing in particular while I looked at my son's face and searched it for some trace of the man I thought I had raised. I found nothing. He was that good. Or maybe I had just never known what to look for before. Clara made me a cup of tea at that Sunday dinner and sat beside me on the porch afterward while Lily chased fireflies in the yard, and she talked about her students and a parent-teacher conference that had gone sideways and a book she was reading that she thought I might like. She was warm and funny and completely unaware that the life she believed she was living had been quietly hollowed out from the inside. Every time she laughed, I had to look away. Doyle knocked on my door on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. He was carrying a manila folder thick enough that the clasp strained to hold it shut. He set it on my kitchen table, and he looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for the moments in our working lives when the evidence had come back worse than expected. "Sit down, Arthur," he said. I sat. He opened the folder. "The affair has been going on for 2 years and 4 months, he said, laying the first set of documents in front of me. I have hotel receipts from 6 separate locations: Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Bristol, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and 1 weekend stay at a resort outside of Asheville that she told Raymond was a contractors' conference." He paused. There was no contractors' conference. I looked at the receipts. Dates, room numbers, charges for room service and minibar. The kind of paper trail that people convince themselves they are not leaving while they are leaving it. "Keep going," I said. Doyle laid down a second set of documents. Bank statements. Page after page of them highlighted in yellow at irregular intervals. Over the past 18 months, Julian has moved approximately $60,000 out of the joint account he holds with Clara. The withdrawals were structured carefully, never more than $3,000 at a time, spread across different days of the month, to avoid triggering automatic flags. Some went to a personal account in Julian's name only. Some went directly to Victoria's business account, recorded as consulting fees for work that was never performed. The kitchen tilted slightly. I put both hands flat on the table. $60,000, I said. "Yes," Doyle said, "from the account he shares with Clara." "Yes." I stood up from the table so fast, my chair scraped back and nearly tipped over. I walked to the kitchen window, and I stood there with my back to Doyle and my hands pressed against the window frame, and I stared out at the dogwood in the yard, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I had learned to breathe through the worst moments in a courtroom, when what was being said was so monstrous that the only dignified response was no response at all. "Arthur," Doyle said behind me. Give me a minute, I said. My voice came out rough and strange like something dragged over gravel. He gave me the minute without another word. When I turned back around, my face was under control. The rest of me was not entirely, but my face was. I sat back down. I pulled the bank statements toward me and I read through every highlighted line. $60,000. Taken in careful, calculated increments over 18 months. Clara's money, too. Money she had earned standing in front of a classroom 5 days a week. Money that was supposed to be building a future for a 7-year-old girl who kept a stuffed rabbit named Gerald on her pillow and thought the cabin was the most beautiful place in the world. "There is one more thing," Doyle said, and his voice had gone careful in a way that made me look up. He laid down a single photograph. It was a picture of Victoria's construction yard taken from the street, a modest operation, one main building, and an equipment shed. On the side of the building, painted in large letters, was the company name, Vance Custom Build. Her primary lender called the note 2 weeks ago, Doyle said. She has 30 days to refinance or the equipment gets seized. My best estimate is that without a significant cash injection in the next 30 to 60 days, Victoria Vance does not have a company anymore. I looked at the bank statements. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the dates on the hotel receipts and the dates on the withdrawals, and I watched the whole ugly architecture of it assemble itself in front of me with the kind of terrible clarity that only comes when you have been a judge long enough to recognize the structure of a crime, even when it is wearing the face of someone you love. Julian had not just been unfaithful, he had been funding it. Systematically, carefully, with money that did not entirely belong to him, taken from a woman who trusted him completely to prop up a failing business belonging to a woman who had walked into his home under the pretense of honest work and walked out with something that was not hers to take. I looked at Doyle. "My God," I said. Doyle nodded once slowly and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. I looked back down at the folder, at Clara's money reduced to highlighted lines on a bank statement, at Lily's future quietly stolen $2,500 at a time. And I felt something harden in my chest that I knew from long experience was not going to soften again until this was finished. Harlan Finch had been the best divorce attorney in Buncombe County for as long as I could remember, which was saying something because I had known a great many divorce attorneys in my time, and most of them were good at exactly one thing and mediocre at everything else. Harlan was different. He had started his career as a public defender, which meant he had spent his formative years learning how systems failed people before he learned how to use those same systems to protect them. He was in his early 60s now, trim and unhurried, with the kind of deliberate stillness that courtrooms either give you or take from you entirely. It had given it to him. We had been on opposite sides of enough proceedings over the years that we had developed a mutual respect that functioned in practical terms, like friendship, without requiring either of us to pretend we liked each other more than we did. I called him the morning after Doyle left and asked if I could come in. "How serious?" he said. "Serious enough that I drove to your office instead of calling," I said. "Come at 2, he said. His office was on the 3rd floor of a building on College Street, with tall windows that looked out over the mountains to the west. I set Doyle's manila folder on his desk at 2 o'clock exactly and sat down across from him without saying anything. Harlan opened the folder, put on his reading glasses, and began to read. He did not speak for 41 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on his wall with the same focused attention I had once given to juries during deliberation. He turned pages, slowly went back twice to reread sections, and made 3 small marks in the margin of the bank statements with a pencil he kept behind his ear. When he finally closed the folder and pushed his glasses up onto his forehead, he looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped would not be confirmed. "Your son is in serious trouble," he said. "Tell me what I already know," I said. "Then tell me what I don't." Harlan leaned back in his chair. "What you know is that your son has been unfaithful to his wife for over 2 years. In North Carolina, adultery on its own is grounds for divorce, but it does not move the needle much on property division. What you may not fully appreciate yet is that what he has done goes considerably beyond adultery." He tapped the bank statements with one finger. "Moving $60,000 of marital funds in structured increments to support an extramarital affair and subsidize his partner's failing business is not a personal failing. It is a legal one. The technical term is dissipation of marital assets. It means he has deliberately wasted or depleted marital property for a purpose unrelated to the marriage. Courts take a dim view of it." "How dim?" I said. "Dim enough that Clara's attorney, assuming she retains a competent one, can argue that the $60,000 be factored directly into the property settlement, not split, credited entirely to her side of the ledger." He paused. "On top of that, the pattern of deception, 2 years of systematic lying, hidden accounts, falsified records that becomes relevant in the custody evaluation. A judge looking at that pattern is going to have questions about Julian's judgment and his honesty as a parent." My hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "Primary custody," I said, "for Clara." "It is a strong argument," Harlan said carefully. "Not a guarantee, but a strong argument, yes, particularly if the documentation is as clean as this." He gestured at the folder. "Which it appears to be." I exhaled slowly. Something in my chest loosened by a fraction, the first fraction it had loosened in 3 weeks. "There is a condition," Harlan said, and his voice sharpened slightly. "Timing. If Clara finds out before we file, if Julian finds out we are coming, if Victoria Vance gets wind of this through any channel and has a chance to make a phone call, the window closes. Julian hides assets. Victoria destroys records. By the time we get in front of a judge, the story has been rewritten, and we are fighting a much harder case." He leaned forward. "We file first. We move fast. And nobody on the other side knows it is coming until the papers are in their hands." "Understood," I said. "Have you told Clara?" Harlan asked. "No." "When? Soon," I said. "But not yet. There is something I need to do first." Harlan studied me over the top of his glasses with the particular look he reserved for clients who were about to complicate his life. "Arthur," he said slowly, "whatever you are planning, make sure it does not compromise the evidence or give Julian grounds to claim harassment or illegal surveillance. Chapikam. The photographs were taken on my property," I said. "By me. Without trespassing anywhere I did not have the right to be." Harlan considered that for a moment. Then he nodded, once the small, precise nod of a man who has decided to trust a colleague's judgment, while reserving the right to say he told them so. "All right," he said. "Then do what you need to do. But call me the moment you are ready to move. I want to be able to file within 24 hours of your signal." I stood up and picked up the folder. "Harlan," I said. "Yes. Thank you." He waved a hand as if gratitude were a minor inconvenience. "Thank me when we win," he said. "Now go make your phone call." I walked out of his office and down 3 flights of stairs and out into the November cold with the manila folder under my arm and one name turning over and over in my mind. Raymond Vance. Doyle had included a photograph of Raymond Vance near the back of the folder, behind the bank statements and the hotel receipts. It was a candid shot taken outside the hospital, the kind of picture a careful investigator takes without announcing himself. Raymond was in his scrubs navy blue, walking toward the parking lot with his head down and a coffee cup in one hand, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has just finished a long shift, written into every line of his body. He looked like a decent man. That was the thing that hit me hardest, standing in my kitchen that Thursday morning with the folder open on the counter. He looked like exactly the kind of man who deserved better than what was being done to him. I thought about Helen. I thought about the 6 years since she had been gone, and how the missing of her had changed shape over time, but had never once gotten smaller. I thought about what it would have meant to me in those early years when the grief was still fresh enough to be physical if someone had known something about Helen that I deserved to know and had chosen to stay quiet for their own convenience. I would never have forgiven that person, not in this lifetime. I picked up my phone. I had Raymond's cell number from Doyle's file. I stood at my kitchen counter with the November light coming flat and gray through the window, and I dialed. He picked up on the 4th ring. His voice was thick with the particular heaviness of a man who has just been woken up after a night shift. "Hello, Mr. Vance," I said. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I am calling from Asheville, North Carolina. I am sorry to contact you this way, and I am sorry for what I am about to tell you. But I believe you have a right to know what I know." A long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had sharpened considerably, the sleep gone out of it. "Who did you say you are?" "Arthur Sterling. I am a retired criminal court judge. My son is Julian Sterling." I paused to let that land. "I have reason to believe that my son and your wife have been involved with each other for approximately 2 years and 4 months. I have documentation. Photographs, hotel receipts, bank records. I am prepared to send all of it to you within the hour." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then Raymond Vance made a sound that I recognized from 35 years on the bench. It was the sound a person makes when something they have been desperately hoping was not true turns out to be true. Not a cry exactly. Something smaller and more devastating than a cry. Something that lives in the throat and cannot quite get out. "I have been telling myself I was imagining things for over a year," he said finally. His voice was raw, scraped clean of everything except the truth of what he was saying. "She started working late. Lots of overnight trips for jobs that never seemed to produce invoices I could find. I asked her once about 8 months ago straight out. I asked her if there was someone else." He stopped. "What did she say?" I asked. "She cried," he said, and the bitterness in those 2 words was so concentrated, it came through the phone like heat. "She told me I was being paranoid. She told me she was working herself half to death trying to save the company, and the least I could do was trust her. And I believed her, Mr. Sterling. God help me, I believed her, because I wanted to." His breath caught. "I have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I believed her because the alternative was something I could not figure out how to survive. My chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with my own situation." "Mr. Vance," I said. "Raymond, I am sending you the file right now. All of it. You deserve to make your own decisions with the same information my son is going to receive very shortly." I heard him exhale, a long, shuddering breath that carried 2 years of accumulated doubt and self-recrimination and exhausted hope all the way down the line from Maryville to Asheville. "Send it," he said. I sent it. He called me back 47 minutes later. The man who called back was not the same man who had answered the phone the first time. The rawness was still there, but underneath it now was something harder, something that had been waiting a long time for permission to exist. "I have read everything," he said, without preamble, without any of the tentative quality of the first call. Mr. Sterling, I want to ask you something. Ask, I said. When are you confronting your son? Friday evening, I said. I have asked him to come to my house for dinner. I want to go to Victoria at the same time, Raymond said. The exact same time. I do not want her to have 30 seconds to call him and get a story together. I do not want him to have 30 seconds to call her. I want them both to find out at the same moment with no warning and no time to coordinate. I closed my eyes. That was precisely what I had been hoping he would say, and hearing him say it with such quiet clarity made my throat tighten in a way I had not anticipated. Friday at 6:15, I said. I will sit Julian down at 6:15 exactly. I will be at her yard at 6:15, Raymond said. His voice was absolutely steady now. Steadier than mine. My brother is going to come with me. Victoria has a temper, and I am not going to be stupid about this. That is wise, I said. A pause. Mr. Sterling, Raymond said. Why are you doing this? You did not have to call me. I looked out at the dogwood tree in my yard. The last few leaves were hanging on in the cold wind, trembling, but not yet letting go. Because someone should have called me 6 years ago, I said. And because you have 2 children who deserve a father who knows the truth. Raymond did not say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, I said. Get through Friday first. I called Julian on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, which was late enough that he would already be at his desk, and early enough that he would not yet be too deep into his day to think clearly about an unexpected invitation. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, Dad. Easy, warm, completely unsuspecting. The voice of a man who had no idea that the ground beneath him had already been mined. What's up? I wanted to see if you could come for dinner tomorrow evening, I said. I kept my voice at the same register I always used with him. Unhurried. Ordinary. The voice of a father with nothing particular on his mind. I have some paperwork I have been meaning to go through, and I could use a second set of eyes on a couple of things. Nothing urgent. Just easier to talk through in person. Sure, absolutely, Julian said, and I heard him clicking something on his keyboard, checking his calendar the way he always did, that small habit of a man who scheduled everything. What time works for you? 6 o'clock, I said. I will make something simple. Perfect. Clara is taking Lily to her sister's for the weekend anyway, so my evening is open. I gripped the phone a little tighter. Clara was taking Lily away for the weekend. Clara, who did not yet know what was in the manila folder that Harlan Finch would be delivering to her by courier that same Friday afternoon at 5:30. Clara, who would be reading the contents of that folder while her daughter was safely at her sister's house, and while her husband was sitting across a dinner table from his father 30 minutes away. Sometimes the pieces arrange themselves. 6 o'clock, I said again. See you then, son. See you tomorrow, Dad. Love you. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter very carefully, the way you set down something that might break if handled wrong, and I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting on it. Then I called Harlan. It is set for tomorrow evening, I told him. Julian arrives at my house at 6. I will give him 15 minutes to settle in before I put the folder on the table. Behind her in the doorway stood Patricia, one hand holding Lily's, and the other pressed flat against the doorframe, the way people stand when they have been waiting a long time and are not sure yet whether what they are waiting for is good news or something else. Patricia had driven to Susan's house that morning to bring Lily to the courthouse at Clara's request, so that whatever the outcome was, Lily would be close. She needs to have it in her hands before Julian sits down across from me, but not so far in advance that she has time to call him first. I will handle it personally, Harlan said. Arthur, are you certain about this? I have been certain since the moment I saw that folder, I said. Clara deserves to know before anyone tells her what to think about it. She deserves to read it herself and make her own decisions. All right, Harlan said. I will have it delivered at 5:35. After I hung up, I spent an hour on the phone with Clara's closest friend, a woman named Patricia who taught at the same school, and who had the particular quality of steadiness that made her the kind of person you wanted nearby when things fell apart. I did not tell Patricia everything. I told her enough. I told her that Clara was going to receive some very difficult news tomorrow evening, and that she should be available by phone and prepared to drive to Clara if needed. Patricia asked me 2 questions and then said, I understand, Arthur. I will be there. By noon, I had done everything that could be done before Friday. The afternoon was the hardest part. I tried to read. I made it 4 pages into a book before I realized I had not retained a single word and set it face down on the side table. I tried to take a walk through the neighborhood, but the November air felt hostile in a way it usually did not, and I came back inside after 20 minutes. I sat in my office, and I looked at the legal pad with its 3 pages of notes and the 2 names at the bottom, and I thought about what tomorrow evening was going to do to my son. Not to his marriage, not to his finances, to him, to the person he was. Julian had been 6 years old when he first caught a fish on that lake behind the cabin. He had been so excited that he had dropped the rod trying to hold it up, and I had grabbed it before it went in the water, and we had stood there together, both of us holding the rod, both of us laughing with the morning sun just coming over the ridge. He had made me promise not to tell his mother how close the rod had come to going in, because she had only just stopped worrying about him falling in the dock. That boy was still there somewhere. That thought did not make what I was doing harder, but it made it heavier. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon at 7 in the evening and took it out to the back porch and sat in the chair Helen had always used, the one with the worn armrests where her elbows had rested for 22 summers. The sky was going dark over the mountains, in layers deep blue at the top, shading down to a pale amber at the horizon line, where the last of the light was holding on. I sat there until the amber was gone. I went inside at 8. I laid out what I needed for tomorrow. The folder, 2 glasses, the bourbon. I set them on the kitchen counter in a row with the same deliberateness I had once used to arrange evidence exhibits before a difficult session. I went to bed at 10. I lay in the dark for a long time with my eyes open and my hands folded on my chest, and my mind running through tomorrow's sequence of events, the way it had once run through closing arguments, looking for weaknesses, testing the logic, checking the timing. At some point, without quite deciding to, I fell asleep. I woke at 5:47 in the morning, to gray light coming through the curtains, and the sound of a mockingbird going through its full repertoire in the dogwood outside my window, completely indifferent to the fact that this was going to be the hardest day of my son's life. 12 hours. I got up, put the coffee on, and waited. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Julian had always been punctual. It was one of the things I had taught him young and that had stuck, one of the small inheritances that pass between fathers and sons without either party quite noticing. I heard his footsteps on the porch, the particular rhythm of them, and for one suspended moment I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the back of a chair, and I let myself feel the full weight of what the next hour was going to do. Then I walked to the door and opened it. He looked good. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing that hit me hardest, because it would have been easier if he had looked guilty or diminished, or in some way marked by what he had been doing. He did not. He was wearing a dark green flannel shirt I had not seen before, and he had gotten a haircut recently, and he was smiling the easy smile of a man who believed he was simply having dinner with his father on a Friday evening. "Hey, Dad." He stepped in and gave me a one-armed hug, the same hug he had given me since he was tall enough to reach my shoulder. "Something smells good. What are we having?" "Come sit down at the table first," I said. "There is something I need to talk to you about before we eat." Something shifted in his expression, a small flicker there and gone. "Everything okay? You're not sick or anything?" "I am fine," I said. "Sit down, Julian." He sat. I set a glass of bourbon in front of him, without asking, and took my own seat across the table. The manila folder was on the chair beside me, face down where he could not see it yet. I looked at my son across the kitchen table that my father had built from a single slab of walnut, and I thought for just a moment about the 11-year-old boy who had sat in this same chair and told me he wanted to be an architect when he grew up, because he liked the idea of building things that lasted. "Julian," I said. "I went up to the cabin on the 3rd Tuesday of October to winterize it." His face did not change. "Right, you mentioned that. How did it look up there?" "I found a black Ford F-150 parked in front of the porch when I arrived," I said. I did not recognize it, so I did not go inside. The stillness that moved across his face then was the stillness of a man whose body has just received information that his mind has not yet fully processed. His smile did not disappear all at once. It faded the way a light fades when the power is going but has not gone yet. "Dad," he started. "Let me finish," I said quietly. I reached down to the chair beside me. I picked up the manila folder and I placed it on the table in front of him. He looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then he reached out and opened it. The first photograph was the one I had taken through the kitchen window. Julian and Victoria at my table, her leaning toward him, his hand covering hers. He looked at it for a very long time, without making any sound. His jaw tightened until I could see the muscle jumping under his skin. He turned the page. The next photographs were from the back deck. Julian with his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking out at the lake. The whiskey. The easy, comfortable intimacy of two people who had been doing this for a long time. He turned through them one by one with hands that had started to tremble, a fine tremor that began in his fingers and worked its way up to his wrists. "Dad," he said again, and this time his voice cracked straight down the middle like green wood. "Keep reading," I said. He turned to the hotel receipts. 6 locations over 2 years and 4 months. His face had gone the color of old ash gray and flat, every trace of the easy smile completely gone now. He pressed his lips together so hard, they went white at the edges. His eyes were bright and glassy and blinking too fast. Then he reached the bank statements. I watched my son read through those highlighted lines, and I watched something happen to him that I had no word for, and that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was not anger, and it was not shame, though both of those were in it. It was the specific, annihilating expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what he has done and found that the understanding is worse than the doing. His hands stopped trembling. They went very still on the page, pressed flat against the paper, the way hands press flat against something when the body needs an anchor. Then he pushed back from the table so hard his chair legs screamed against the floor, and he stood up, and he walked to the kitchen window, and he stood there with his back to me, and his shoulders pulled up around his ears, and his head bowed forward. His shoulders began to shake. Not loudly. Julian had always cried the way I cried, which was as quietly and as privately as possible, as if grief were something that ought to be conducted without witnesses. His whole back shook with it, great silent heaves, that he was clearly doing everything in his power to control and could not quite manage. I did not go to him. I did not speak. I let him have it the way my own father had let me have the moments that needed to be had without an audience, even when the audience was someone who loved you. I looked at the clock on the wall. 6:14. 1 minute. I picked up my bourbon and I held it in both hands, and I looked at my son standing at the window of the kitchen where he had eaten 1,000 meals as a boy, and I felt my own throat close up tight and my own eyes burn hot, and I made myself breathe through it because there was still one more thing that needed to be said before 6:15. "Julian," I said quietly, "sit back down. There is something else you need to know." Julian turned from the window slowly, the way a man turns when he is not entirely sure his legs will hold him. His face was a ruin. Eyes red-rimmed and swollen jaw set hard against whatever was still trying to come out, the particular devastation of a man who has just cried in front of his father for the first time since he was a boy and does not know what to do with that. He came back to the table and lowered himself into the chair like someone who had aged 20 years in the past 10 minutes. "What else?" he said. It was not quite a question. I looked at the clock. 6:14 and 40 seconds. "There is a man named Raymond Vance," I said. "He is 43 years old. He works as a cardiac nurse in Maryville, Tennessee. He works 60 hours a week. He has 2 children, a 16-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl." I paused. "He is Victoria's husband." Julian closed his eyes. A single tear broke loose from his right eye and ran down his jaw and dropped onto the bank statement, still open in front of him. He did not wipe it away. He did not seem to notice it. "He did not know," I said, "until I called him." Julian's eyes opened. He stared at me. "You called him?" "3 days ago," I said. "I sent him the same file that is sitting in front of you right now. He deserved to know. His children deserved a father who was not being lied to." "Dad." Julian's voice broke again, jagged and raw. "Dad, what have you done?" "I have done what needed doing," I said quietly. "And there is one more thing." I looked at the clock. 6:15. Harlan Finch delivered the petition documents to Clara by courier at 5:35 this afternoon. She had the right to review and sign before anyone moved another step. "By the time you sat down at this table, she had already signed them," I said. "A courier delivered a copy of this documentation to your house at 5:35 this afternoon. Clara has had it in her hands for the past 40 minutes. The sound Julian made then was something I had never heard from him before, and hope never to hear again. It came up from somewhere deep in his chest, a low, strangled sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, something that had no name, because the feeling it came from had no name. The feeling of a man who has just understood that every door has closed at the same moment, and that there is no version of the next 5 minutes that does not require him to walk through the wreckage of everything he has destroyed. I looked at the clock on the wall. 6:15 exactly. Somewhere across town on Cavendish Street, Clara was sitting with that envelope in her hands. And somewhere on the road between Asheville and Maryville, Raymond Vance was already moving. He put both hands over his face. I sat across from him and I let him have it. I looked at the clock and knew that at this exact moment on Cavendish Street, Clara was holding that manila envelope. The illusion of her marriage was shattering. And over in Maryville, Tennessee, Raymond Vance had already confronted Victoria at her construction yard earlier that afternoon, leaving her to face the wreckage while he drove straight toward Asheville to finish what had been started. Back at my kitchen table, Julian lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were swollen nearly shut, and his breathing was still ragged and uneven, coming in long pulls and short releases, like a man trying to find a rhythm he had lost. "Where is Clara now?" he whispered. "She is safe," I said. "Lily is safe. That is what matters." He looked at me across the table with an expression that I did not have a word for then and do not have a word for now. It was not anger. It was something older and more complicated than anger. Something that had grief in it and shame in it, and the very first very fragile thread of something that might years from now become understanding. "What do I do, Dad?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" I looked at my son for a long moment. "You go home," I said, "and you face what is waiting for you there." I stood up and I walked to the door and I held it open. Julian sat at the table for another moment, both hands pressed flat on the walnut surface, head bowed. Then he stood. He did not look at me as he walked past. He walked out onto the porch and down the steps and got into his Jeep and sat there without starting the engine for a long time. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen and I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and I stood at the counter and I drank it in one long swallow. Then I went to the back porch and I sat down in Helen's chair and I waited. Julian drove home the long way. I know this because he called me from his car at 6:47, which meant he had been driving for almost 30 minutes to cover a distance that should have taken 12. He did not say much. He asked me once more if Lily was safe, and I told him yes, she was with Clara's sister. She was fine, she did not know anything yet. He said okay. He said he would call me later. His voice had the flat, hollowed-out quality of a man who has cried everything out and is now running on something that is not quite feeling and not quite numbness, but somewhere in the narrow country between the two. He hung up without saying goodbye. I did not hold it against him. I sat on the back porch in Helen's chair for another hour after that, watching the darkness settle over the mountain ridge and listening to the wind move through the bare dogwoods in the yard. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog was barking at something it had no business barking at. The bourbon glass on the arm of the chair had been empty for a long time. I thought about what Julian was driving home to. Julian called me at 6:47. He had been driving for 35 minutes to cover a distance that should have taken 12, which told me everything I needed to know about the state he was in before he said a single word. "She's gone," he said. His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when a person has cried everything out and arrived somewhere beyond crying. The house is dark. Lily's boots are gone. The backpack hook is empty. A pause. There's an envelope on the coffee table. It's been opened. "I know," I said. "There's a man sitting in Clara's chair," Julian said, and something in his voice shifted. "Dad, there is a man sitting in our living room. His name is Raymond Vance," I said. "Let him say what he came to say." The line went quiet for a moment. "Okay," Julian said finally, very small, very young sounding. "Okay," I said back. I hung up the phone. I sat on the back porch in the dark, and I waited, and I thought about what was happening inside that house on Cavendish Street, and I let Raymond Vance do what he had driven 2 hours to do. The voice came from the armchair in the corner. Julian spun around so fast, he knocked his shin against the coffee table and had to grab the back of the couch to keep from going down. His heart was slamming against his ribs loud enough that he could feel it in his ears. Because sitting in the armchair in the corner of his living room, in the chair where Clara sat every Sunday morning, to drink her coffee and read, was a man he had never seen before in his life. The man was lean and tired-looking, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many night shifts and not enough sleep. He was wearing jeans and a gray Henley, and his hands were resting on the arms of the chair with a deliberate stillness that suggested he had been sitting there for some time, and was prepared to sit there considerably longer if necessary. "Who are you?" Julian said. His voice came out cracked and unsteady. "How did you get in my house?" "Your wife left the back door unlocked," the man said. "I imagine she knew someone might need to use it." He paused. "My name is Raymond Vance. I believe you know my wife." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest silence Julian had ever stood inside of. Raymond did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He did not lean forward or clench his jaw or do any of the things that a man in his position might reasonably have been expected to do. He simply sat in Clara's Sunday morning chair and looked at Julian with the level, exhausted gaze of a man who has already done all of his falling apart in private and has arrived here having put himself back together into something harder and more purposeful than what he was before. I worked a 12-hour shift last night on the cardiac floor. Your father called me days ago, Mr. Sterling. I didn't want to believe it, but the file he sent didn't lie. I was at Victoria's Yard at 6:15 this evening, Mr. Sterling. Your father told me the exact time. I left her there with her life in pieces, got in my truck, and drove straight here. I left her there with her life in pieces, got in my truck, and drove 2 hours straight to Asheville. Your wife left the back door unlocked when she packed her bags and left with your daughter an hour ago. I imagine she knew someone might need to use it." Julian's legs were not working properly. He made it to the couch and sat down heavily, both elbows on his knees, head dropping forward. "Yes," he said. "He told me. He sent me the same file your wife has been reading for the past hour," Raymond said. "The hotels, the bank statements, the photographs." A pause. "My daughter is 13 years old. She has been asking me for the past 6 months why her mother seems distracted all the time. I have been telling her that Mom is just stressed about work." His jaw tightened for just a moment, the first crack in the composure, and then smoothed over again. "I will not be telling her that anymore." Julian pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes so hard that colors burst behind his lids. His shoulders were shaking again, that same helpless trembling that had started at his father's kitchen table and apparently had not finished with him yet. "I am sorry," he said, and the words came out so broken and inadequate that saying them felt worse than not saying them. "Raymond, I am so sorry. I know that does not mean anything right now, but I am sorry." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "It does not mean anything right now." He stood up from the chair, unhurried, and straightened his Henley. "I am not here because I wanted to say something to you, Mr. Sterling. I am here because your father asked me to deliver something." He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the coffee table next to the manila envelope. "That is a copy of the divorce filing my attorney submitted this afternoon. It includes a claim for the recovery of marital assets dissipated to support your business ventures with my wife over the past 18 months. Julian stared at the piece of paper. "My attorney and your father's attorney have already spoken," Raymond said. "I am told the documentation is extensive." He buttoned the top button of his Henley with steady fingers. "I hope for your daughter's sake that you find a way to be better than you have been, Mr. Sterling. Children need at least one parent they can count on." He walked to the front door. He opened it. The cold night air came in and moved through the living room, lifting the edges of the papers on the coffee table very slightly before settling again. Raymond paused in the doorway with his back to Julian. "Tell your father," he said, "that I said thank you." Then he walked out. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click that was somehow louder than a slam. Julian sat on his couch in the house that was no longer his home, surrounded by photographs of a life he had dismantled with his own hands, and he did not move for a very long time. Outside, a car started. Headlights swept briefly across the living room wall and then were gone. The house was absolutely silent. And in that silence, Julian Sterling finally understood the full and irreversible weight of everything he had thrown away. The back porch of my house faces east, which means it catches the first light in the morning and holds the dark longest in the evening. I had always liked that about it. Helen had always liked it too, for different reasons. She said it made the evenings feel longer, like the day was reluctant to give up and go home. I sat in her chair with an empty bourbon glass, and I looked out at the dark shape of the mountains against the slightly less dark shape of the sky, and I waited for the phone to ring. It rang at 8:17. Not Julian. Clara. I picked up on the first ring. Clara. Dad. Her voice was thick and wet, and very young sounding the way voices get when the crying has been going on long enough that the throat gives up trying to recover between waves. She had never called me Dad before tonight. She had always called me Arthur from the very first Sunday dinner Julian had brought her to, when she had shaken my hand at the door with those serious brown eyes and said it was nice to meet me, Arthur, and I had decided on the spot that my son had done considerably better than he deserved. Dad, She stopped, took a breath that shuddered all the way in and all the way out. I don't know what to say to you right now. You don't have to say anything, I said. I have been sitting in my sister's kitchen for the past hour reading that folder, and I keep thinking I must have misread something because it cannot possibly. She stopped again. I heard her pressing her hand over her mouth the way people do when they are trying to hold something that is determined to come out. 2 years, Arthur. 2 years and 4 months. And the money. Our money. Lily's money. I know, I said. Did you know before October? She asked, and her voice was very careful when she asked it, careful in the way of someone who needs the answer to be a specific thing and is terrified it will not be. No, I said. I found out the same day I called Doyle. The 3rd Tuesday of October. I did not know a single thing before that morning. She exhaled, a long, shaking release of breath. Okay, she said softly. Okay. I believe you. Oh, Clara, I said. I need you to call Harlan Finch tomorrow morning. First thing. He is expecting to hear from you, and he is ready to move on your behalf. He is the best there is, and he is already up to speed on everything. I will, she said. Arthur, I have to ask you something. Ask. Why did you wait? Why didn't you just come to me directly when you found out? I had been expecting this question. I had been turning the answer over in my mind for 3 weeks, and I still was not entirely sure I had it right. Because if I had come to you first, I said slowly, you would have confronted Julian before we had the full picture. He would have had time to move, money, destroy records, get his story straight. By the time a lawyer got involved, the evidence would have been compromised, and you would have been fighting from behind. I paused. I needed to build the case before I brought it to the people it belonged to. Not because you could not handle the truth, because you deserved the truth with armor around it. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a long time. Lily asked me tonight why we were staying at Aunt Susan's, Clara said finally. I told her it was an adventure. She said okay, and asked if she could have ice cream for breakfast tomorrow, and I said yes, and she thought that was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Her voice broke on the last word, and she laughed at the same time, that particular broken laugh that only exists at the intersection of grief and love. She has no idea, Arthur. She is just eating ice cream and sleeping with Gerald, and she has absolutely no idea. My throat closed. She is going to be fine, I said, and I meant it with every part of myself that still knew how to mean things. She has you, and she has me. She is going to be fine. I know, Clara said. I know she is. A pause. Thank you, Dad. I don't have a word big enough for what you did, but thank you. I opened my mouth to answer her, and found that nothing came out, not because I did not have words, because the words that were there were too large for the moment, and I did not trust my voice to carry them without breaking. I pressed my lips together and looked out at the dark mountains, and I breathed. Get some sleep, I managed finally. Call Harlan at 8 tomorrow morning. I will check in with you in the afternoon. Okay, she said. Good night, Arthur. I love you. I love you too, Clara, I said. Give Lily a hug from me. I set the phone down on the arm of the chair. And then I sat very still in the dark for a moment, and I let what had been building in my chest for the past 3 weeks finally come. It did not come loudly. I had never been a loud man, and grief had not changed that about me. It came the way it always came, quietly, and without warning, a pressure behind the eyes, and a tightening at the back of the throat, and then the slow, unstoppable release of something that had been held too long. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth the way Clara had done on the phone, and I looked out at the mountains, and I cried. Not for myself, not for what Julian had done to me or to the family I had tried to build. I cried for the boy who had dropped his fishing rod into the lake at age 6 and laughed so hard he nearly went in after it. I cried for the 22-year-old who had called me from a parking lot in Charlotte to tell me he had met someone incredible, and his voice had been so lit up with it that I had sat in my truck for 10 minutes after we hung up, just smiling at nothing. I cried for every version of my son that had existed before the version that had sat across my kitchen table tonight, with his face destroyed and his hands pressing flat on the walnut surface, looking for something solid to hold on to. I cried for the man he could have been. I do not know how long it lasted. Long enough. When it was finished, I felt hollowed out in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, the particular emptiness that follows a grief that has finally been given its proper space. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I picked up the empty bourbon glass. I went inside. I washed the 2 glasses I had set out for the evening, dried them, put them back in the cabinet. I straightened the kitchen chairs. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the house the way I moved through it every night. Room by room, the same circuit I had walked alone for 6 years. I went to bed. I lay in the dark, with my hands folded on my chest, and I thought about Clara sitting in her sister's kitchen. I thought about Lily eating ice cream and sleeping with Gerald, and believing the world was still the good and trustworthy place it had always been for her. I thought about Julian alone in that house on Cavendish Street. And then I thought about Monday morning. Monday morning. Harlan would walk into the Buncombe County Courthouse with a manila folder under his arm and file the paperwork that would begin the formal dismantling of my son's marriage. The machinery of consequence would begin to turn slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum the way those things always turned. There would be hearings and depositions and arguments about property and custody schedules and the division of a shared life into its component parts. It would be long, and it would be hard, and it would cost everyone involved more than they could currently calculate. But it would be honest. And honesty, in my experience, was the only foundation anything worth keeping had ever been built on. I closed my eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the dogwood tree in the yard, a sound like the turning of many small pages, and I let it carry me down into the first real sleep I had gotten in 3 weeks. The Buncombe County Courthouse smelled the same way it had always smelled, like old paper and floor wax, and the particular institutional neutrality of a building that has absorbed decades of human desperation without taking sides. I had spent the better part of 35 years in buildings like this one, and the smell had never bothered me. That morning in June, walking down the third-floor hallway toward courtroom 7 with Harlan Finch at my side and Clara 2 steps behind us, it hit me differently than it used to. It smelled like the end of something. Clara had dressed carefully for the hearing. Dark navy blazer. Her hair pulled back, the kind of quiet, composed appearance that said, "I am someone who takes this seriously," without saying I am someone who is falling apart. She had lost weight over the 8 months since October, not dramatically, but enough that the blazer sat slightly differently than it would have a year ago. Her eyes were clear and steady, and she walked with the particular straightness of a woman who has decided that whatever happens inside that courtroom, she is not going to let anyone see her bend. I was proud of her in a way that had no adequate expression. Julian was already in the hallway when we arrived, standing with his attorney near the water fountain at the far end. He looked thinner too, and older the way men get older fast when the structure of their daily life is removed, and they have to figure out how to stand up without it. He was wearing a gray suit I had not seen before. When he saw me, he held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked away, and I felt the particular ache of that 2 seconds in my chest for the rest of the morning. Harlan had been thorough in the way that only a man who genuinely enjoys the work can be thorough. He had organized the documentation into a presentation that moved from the photographic evidence to the financial records to the legal argument with the clean, relentless logic of someone who has spent 40 years learning exactly how much rope to give the other side before pulling it taut. The judge was a woman named Calloway, mid-50s, with the unhurried authority of someone who had heard every version of every story and was no longer surprised by any of them. She read through the submitted documentation, with her glasses on the end of her nose and her expression carefully neutral, turning pages with the steady patience of a woman who intended to understand every word before she said anything about any of it. Julian's attorney was competent. I will give him that. He stood up and argued that the financial transfers had been for legitimate business purposes, that the consulting fees paid to Vance Custom Build represented real work performed, that the documentation had been obtained through a process that bordered on harassment of his client. He made the arguments with a straight face and reasonable fluency, and I sat in the gallery and watched him make them and thought about how many times I had sat on the other side of exactly this kind of presentation, watching a defense attorney argue against evidence that did not have another interpretation, and knowing that he knew it too. Harlan let him finish. Then Harlan stood up and spent 40 minutes methodically dismantling every argument that had just been made. He presented the subcontractor statements that confirmed no consulting work had been performed by Vance Custom Build for the Sterling household during the period in question. He presented the testimony of a forensic accountant who had traced the movement of $60,000 from the joint account through 3 separate transactions to Victoria Vance's personal checking account. He presented the hotel receipts alongside the corresponding bank withdrawals that matched them to the penny. He presented the timeline of the affair alongside the timeline of the financial transfers and demonstrated with the kind of calm, methodical precision that good lawyers reserve for the moments when the evidence does not need decoration that the two were not coincidental. The dissipation of marital assets in this case, Harlan said, turning to face Judge Calloway directly, was not a single impulsive act. It was a sustained, deliberate campaign conducted over 18 months, carefully structured to avoid detection and executed with a sophistication that speaks to premeditation rather than passion. The court should treat it accordingly. Judge Calloway looked at Julian's attorney over the top of her glasses. Julian's attorney did not have anything left to say. The custody portion of the hearing was the part I had been dreading most. Julian's attorney tried to argue that his client was a devoted father, that his personal failings had no bearing on his parenting, that primary physical custody should remain with both parents equally. He called Julian to the stand, and Julian sat there in the witness chair and answered questions about Lily's school schedule and her medical appointments, and her favorite books, with a genuine knowledge and a genuine grief that made the gallery very quiet. I watched my son on that stand, and I thought about every version of him I had ever known. And I did not feel triumph, not even close to triumph. I felt the particular exhausted sorrow of a man who has done the right thing and discovered that doing the right thing does not feel the way you expect it to feel when it is someone you love who is paying the price. Harlan cross-examined Julian for 22 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He simply walked Julian through the timeline of the affair month by month and asked him at each interval where Lily had been, who had been caring for her, what Clara had been doing while Julian was in Pigeon Forge or Gatlinburg or Bristol with another woman. He asked Julian whether during the 18 months he had been systematically removing money from the joint account he had ever considered what that money was supposed to be for. He asked Julian whether he had told a single person the truth about any of it at any point during 2 years and 4 months. Julian answered every question honestly. I will give him that too. When it was over, Judge Calloway took 40 minutes in chambers before she came back. Primary physical custody to Clara Sterling. Every other weekend, visitation to Julian Sterling with conditions including mandatory participation in a family counseling program. Property settlement adjusted to reflect the $60,000 in dissipated marital assets, credited entirely to Clara's side of the ledger. The marital home to Clara with Julian to receive a reduced share of the retirement account in recognition of the asset dissipation finding. Julian sat very still when the judgment was read. He did not react visibly. He just sat there with his hands flat on the table in front of him and his eyes forward and his jaw set. And I recognized the posture because it was the same posture I had seen on him the night before at my kitchen table, the posture of a man using every available resource just to stay upright. When the session was adjourned, he stood and shook his attorney's hand and walked toward the door without looking at me or at Clara. He walked the way a man walks when he is holding himself together with the understanding that he can fall apart later somewhere private where no one who matters can see. At the door, he stopped. He turned, and he looked at me across the length of the courtroom for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. His face was very still and very tired. Then he nodded once, a small, barely perceptible thing, and walked out. I stood in the gallery, and I watched the door close behind him, and I pressed my hand flat against my sternum because something in my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with it at the same time. Arthur, I turned. Clara was standing beside me, her eyes bright, her composure intact, by what looked like a very narrow margin. Behind her in the doorway, I could see Patricia holding Lily by the hand, and the moment Lily saw me, her whole face broke open into that enormous smile that she had been giving me since she was old enough to know who I was. Pop, pop. She pulled free of Patricia's hand and ran across the marble floor toward me with her arms out and her dark braids flying and her small shoes making an enormous amount of noise for someone so little. I crouched down, ignoring everything my hip had to say about that, and I caught her, and I held her against my chest, and I pressed my face into her hair, and I breathed. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo Clara always bought her. She felt like the whole reason any of it had been worth doing. Doyle called me on the 14th of March, a Thursday, while I was in the backyard, trying to do something useful with the dormant rose bushes along the back fence that Helen had planted, and that I had been failing to adequately care for ever since. I pulled off my work glove to answer the phone. "It's done," Doyle said. Vance Custom Build filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy this morning. The judge signed the order at 9:45. The equipment gets liquidated, the shop lease gets terminated, and the subcontractors who have been waiting 18 months to get paid will get somewhere between 30 and 40 cents on the dollar if they are lucky. I stood in the yard with my work glove in one hand and my phone in the other, and I looked at the rose bushes and I waited for something to happen inside my chest. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. The clean, finished feeling of a thing that has been set in motion, arriving at its destination. It did not come. What came instead was a kind of heaviness that settled across my shoulders like weather. "Thank you, Doyle," I said. "For everything. That's what you pay me for," he said. Then after a pause that was not quite his usual professional silence, "You doing all right, Arthur?" "Working on it," I said. He told me he would send a final summary report by the end of the week, and I told him that was fine, and we hung up. I stood in the yard for another few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just standing there with the March light coming thin and cold through the bare branches of the dogwood and the rose bushes looking exactly as neglected as they had before I started. Then I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Victoria Vance. I had not thought about her much specifically in the months since October. She had existed in my mind mostly as a component of the larger situation rather than as a person with her own particular weight. But that morning, thinking about the bankruptcy filing, I found myself thinking about her more carefully. I am 46 years old. 8 years of building something from nothing, which is not easy regardless of how it ends. A business that had presumably started with some genuine intention, some real work before the money got complicated and the lines got blurred, and the whole structure became something it was never meant to be. I did not feel sorry for her. I want to be clear about that. What she had done to Raymond and to their children and to my family was not something I was capable of excusing because she had also once worked hard. People work hard and make terrible choices every day. The work does not cancel the choices, but I did not feel triumphant either. Triumph requires a kind of distance from the wreckage that I had never been able to manage, not in 35 years on the bench, and not now. The wreckage was real, and it had weight, and standing next to it, feeling pleased about it, had always seemed to me like a poverty of imagination. Doyle sent me one more piece of information 2 weeks later, almost as a footnote in his final report. Julian had moved out of the Cavendish Street townhouse in February, 1 week after the property transfer was finalized, and had taken a month-to-month lease on a one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Asheville, a neighborhood I knew well, a neighborhood of narrow streets and older buildings and people who were between one version of their life and the next. I drove past it once. Not to stop, not to do anything, just to see. It was a plain brick building 3 stories with a parking lot in front and a laundry room visible through the ground floor window. Julian's Jeep was in the lot. The window of what I calculated to be his unit was lit from inside a warm yellow rectangle in the gray February afternoon, and there was a shadow moving behind the curtain that I watched for a moment before I drove on. He was there. He was upright. He was doing whatever the first steps of rebuilding a life look like when you are the one who burned it down. That was enough for me to know for now. In May, Doyle confirmed that Victoria had vacated the shop premises on the 15th and that the equipment auction had netted less than a third of the outstanding debt. Raymond, he mentioned almost in passing, had retained an attorney who was pursuing a claim against Victoria's personal assets for the financial damages to their marital estate. I did not ask for more details. That was Raymond's business, and he was clearly capable of handling it. What I did in May was something smaller and more private. I went up to the cabin for a weekend, in the middle of the month, earlier than I usually open it for the season. And I spent 2 days doing the things that needed doing after a winter. Checking the pipes, airing out the bedrooms, cleaning the kitchen, sweeping the porch. Physical work, the kind that requires your body and leaves your mind free to do whatever it needs to do. And what my mind needed to do that weekend was something I did not have a precise name for. I sat on the back porch on the second evening with a glass of bourbon and the lake going gold in the late afternoon light. And I thought about Julian, at age 5, standing at the end of the dock with a fishing rod that was nearly as tall as he was. His small face compressed with the enormous seriousness of a child who has been told that patience is required and is doing his absolute best to provide it. He had caught 3 sunfish that weekend. Small ones, none of them worth keeping, and we had thrown each one back. But he had held each one carefully before releasing it, the way I had taught him, supporting the body with both hands, making sure it righted itself in the water before swimming away. He had watched each one go with the same expression, something between satisfaction and wistfulness, the expression of someone who is learning that some things are better released than kept. I had thought, watching him that day, that he was going to be a good man. I still believed that. Distantly, stubbornly, the way you believe things about people you love, even when they have given you substantial reason to stop. I believed that the man who had looked at me across a courtroom in June and nodded once before walking out had something in him worth salvaging. I believed that the quiet work of becoming better was possible for him if he chose to do it. Whether he would choose it was not something I could know yet. I poured the last of the bourbon onto the porch railing, an old habit Helen had always teased me about, and I watched it drip through the cedar planks and disappear. The lake was absolutely still in the last of the evening light, and somewhere in the back of my mind, like a note heard from a distance, I became aware that October was only 5 months away, that the gravel road would be waiting, that the cabin would need winterizing again, and that this time when I came around that last bend before the clearing, there would be nothing there except the place itself and whatever I chose to bring to it. The gravel road looked exactly the same. That was the first thing I noticed when I turned off the highway and felt the familiar crunch of loose stone under my tires, the way it always sounded in October when the ground had gone dry and the ruts from summer rain had hardened into permanent features of the landscape. The hemlocks pressed in on both sides the way they always had. The light came through them at the particular angle it only achieved in the fall, low and amber and slightly mournful, the way October light always is in the mountains when the leaves are mostly down and the trees have gone back to showing their bones. I came around the last bend before the clearing. The cabin sat exactly where it had always sat, in the center of the clearing, with the lake behind it, and the ridge rising up beyond the lake, and the sky above the ridge going from pale blue at the horizon to something deeper and more serious overhead. The porch was empty. The dock was still in the water, which meant I had work to do. The boats were covered with their canvas tarps, lumpy shapes at the water's edge that always reminded me, for reasons I had never fully analyzed, of sleeping animals. No black Ford F-150. No vehicle of any kind, except the clearing itself, open and ordinary, and exactly what it had always been before last October made it into something else. I sat in my truck for a moment at the edge of the clearing, not because I was afraid of anything, but because the moment seemed to require a moment. 31 Octobers on this road. 31 times around that last bend. And this one was different from all the others, not because of what was there, but because of what was not, and because of what the absence meant, which was that the cabin was just a cabin again. My cabin, my family's cabin, my father's work, and my mother's garden, and Helen's watercolors, and the crayons in the nightstand drawer, and everything that had accumulated here over 60 years of people loving each other in this particular place. I got out of the truck. My hip was better than it had been in the spring, which I attributed to the walking I had taken up in the summer, 2 miles every morning through the neighborhood, whether I felt like it or not. I walked to the water's edge and I stood there for a moment looking out at the lake before I got to work. The surface was glassy, and still the way mountain lakes get in October when the wind has not yet decided to commit to anything. A pair of mergansers were working their way along the far shore, diving and surfacing with the methodical patience of birds who who have all the time in the world. I pulled the dock in sections the way I had always done it. The bracket I had been worried about in the spring had rusted through completely over the summer, and I had to improvise with the rope I kept in the truck bed, a fix that would last the winter but would need proper attention in May. I noted it on the small pad I kept in my jacket pocket. Old habit. I drained the pipes, covered the boats, swept the porch, checked the chimney cap that the squirrels like to investigate in the off-season. I worked steadily, and without hurrying the way work feels when it is work you have done so many times that your hands know what to do without consulting anyone. By early afternoon, I had done everything that needed doing, and I made a pot of coffee on the old stove and carried it out to the porch and sat in the chair I always sat in and looked at the lake. I thought about Helen, not with the acute, breathtaking grief of the early years, the kind that ambushed you in grocery stores and at stoplights and in the middle of sentences that had nothing to do with her. This was something quieter, more like a conversation with someone who was not in the room but was not entirely absent either. I thought about the last summer we had come up here together, the way she had sat in this same chair in the evenings with a book open on her lap, that she was not always reading, watching the water, the way she watched things she found beautiful with a quality of attention that was also a kind of gratitude. I miss you, I thought, in the direction of the lake. The lake did not answer, but it did not need to. I was on my second cup of coffee when I heard the tires on the gravel road. My hand tightened slightly on the cup. Not from fear, just from the particular alertness of a man whose relationship with the sound of unexpected tires on this road had been permanently altered. I set the cup down on the porch railing, and I waited. The car that came around the last bend was a white Honda Civic, Clara's car. She pulled up beside my truck and stopped, and the passenger door flew open before she had fully cut the engine, and Lily came out of that car like something launched, a blur of dark braids and bright yellow jacket and small boots hitting the gravel at a run, already calling my name before she had fully cleared the door. Pop, 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 we surprised you. Didn't we? Did we surprise you? Mom said you wouldn't know we were coming, and I couldn't tell anyone. I kept the secret for 2 whole weeks. Did you know I kept a secret for 2 whole weeks? She hit me at approximately the speed of a determined small person who has been sitting in a car for 2 hours and has strong feelings about it. I caught her and pulled her up into my arms, and she wrapped her legs around my waist and her arms around my neck and pressed her cold cheek against mine, and I held on. You surprised me, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. You completely surprised me. I told you, Lily said triumphantly, craning her neck to look back at Clara, who was walking toward the porch with a smile that reached all the way up. Mom, I told you he wouldn't know. You were absolutely right, Clara said. She came up the porch steps and leaned in and kissed my cheek and squeezed my arm and looked at me with those clear brown eyes that had seen too much in the past year and had somehow come out steadier for it. Hi, Dad. Hi, sweetheart, I said. You didn't have to drive all the way up here. We wanted to, she said simply. Lily has been asking to see the cabin since August, and I thought. She paused and looked out at the lake. I thought it was time to come back. Make some new memories here. I set Lily down, and she immediately ran to the water's edge to investigate something she had spotted on the dock. Her boots loud on the wooden planks, her voice carrying back to us, in fragments of observation, about a very interesting stick and a possible frog situation that required immediate attention. Clara and I stood on the porch and watched her. How are you doing? Clara asked. Really? Better, I said. Getting there. I looked at her. Same, she said. Getting there. She tucked her hands into her jacket pockets and tilted her face up toward the afternoon sun, closing her eyes for a moment, the way people do when they are testing whether warmth still feels the way they remember it feeling. "It's beautiful up here." "It always has been," I said. Pop, pop. Lily's voice carried across the water with the effortless projection of a child who has never once doubted that the world wanted to hear what she had to say. She was standing at the end of the dock where the last section had been before I pulled it in, looking back at me with her hands on her hips in a posture of absolute authority. "Pop, pop, why is the dock only halfway? Did something break? Can we fix it? I can help fix things." "We'll look at it together," I called back. She nodded with great seriousness and turned back to her investigation. I looked out at the lake, at the mergansers still working their way along the far shore, at the light going golden on the water, at my granddaughter standing at the end of the dock with her dark braids and her yellow jacket, and her complete and utterly undiminished conviction that the world was a place worth paying close attention to. And then something happened in my face that I had not felt in a very long time. I smiled. Not a polite smile, not the careful social smile of a man managing an impression. A real one, the kind that starts somewhere below the ribs and arrives on the face without asking permission. The kind that Helen used to say made me look like the version of myself she liked best. It felt like something coming home. We built the fire in the stone ring my father had laid in 1963, 20 feet from the water's edge in the spot where the ground leveled out between the cabin and the lake. I had built fires in that ring every October for as long as I could remember, usually alone, usually in silence, the fire serving the purpose that fires serve for people who are working something out, without quite knowing what it is. That evening, it served a different purpose entirely. Lily had appointed herself fire marshal with the seriousness of someone who takes newly acquired authority very seriously indeed. She had arranged the kindling in a configuration that she described as a log cabin, which she explained was the correct way to build a fire, because she had learned it in school, and her teacher had said so, and therefore it was settled. I had built fires for 50 years, but I was not going to argue with that logic. We built it her way. It caught on the second match, and she looked at me with an expression of profound vindication. "I told you," she said. "You told me, I agreed." She settled in against my left side with the easy, boneless comfort of a child who has decided that this is where she is going to be for the foreseeable future and has no interest in negotiating the terms. Within 20 minutes, her head had migrated from my shoulder to somewhere in the vicinity of my collarbone, and her breathing had gone slow and deep, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was fighting sleep, blinking long and slow like a lamp running low on oil. Clara sat on the other side of the fire, with her knees pulled up, and a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the flames with the expression of someone who is thinking about several things at once, and has decided to let them all exist at the same time without trying to resolve any of them. The lake behind her was black and still. The sky above the ridge had gone from deep blue to something that was almost purple, the last color before full dark, a color that only existed for about 10 minutes on clear October evenings, and that I had been watching for 31 years without ever getting tired of it. "She is almost out," Clara said softly, nodding toward Lily. "Give her 2 more minutes," I said. We sat in the comfortable quiet of people who have been through something together and have arrived collectively at the other side of it. Not the same people who went in. Something rearranged, something tested, and held something that had the particular solidity of a thing that has been pressured and did not break. Lily made a small sound in her sleep and burrowed deeper into my side. I put my arm around her and held her against me and looked at the fire. Arthur, Clara said. Can I say something without you telling me I don't need to say it? I looked across the fire at her. Her face was lit warm by the flames, the shadows moving gently across her features, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with crying and everything to do with the kind of feeling that is too large for any one expression. Say it, I said. She set her mug down on the ground beside her and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with those steady brown eyes that I had trusted from the first evening Julian had brought her to my table. What you did, she said slowly, was not just about finding evidence or building a legal case or protecting assets. I know that is part of what happened, and I am grateful for every bit of it. She paused. But what you really did was stand in the woods behind that cabin for 2 hours in the cold with a camera and a bad hip and a heart that was breaking, and you chose to protect me and Lily over your own pain, over your relationship with your son, over everything that would have been easier. Her voice was very steady and very quiet. I need you to know that I understand that. I need you to know that I will never forget it as long as I live. The fire crackled between us. A log shifted and sent a small shower of sparks up into the dark air, bright orange points rising and fading against the purple sky. I looked down at Lily sleeping against my side. At the small architecture of her face in the firelight, the long lashes and the slightly parted lips, and the absolute total peace of a child who has no idea how much went into the preservation of exactly this moment. Clara, I said. I know you are going to tell me I don't need to thank you, she said. I am, I said. Because I don't want thanks for it. Not because it wasn't hard or because it didn't cost anything. It was, and it did. I looked up at her across the fire. But there was never a moment when I considered doing anything else. You are my daughter. Lily is my granddaughter. Whatever that required of me was what it required. That is the whole of it. Clara pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright, and she blinked once hard, and then the steadiness came back. Helen would have done the same thing, she said softly, if it had been the other way around. That landed somewhere deep and stayed there. Yes, I said. She would have. She would have been considerably less patient about it than I was. Clara laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes up suddenly and cannot be prepared for. And it rang out across the water and faded into the dark, and the silence that followed it was the best kind of silence, the kind that comes after something genuine has been said and does not need to be filled. I thought about Julian, not with the acute grief of the winter months or the complicated sorrow of the courtroom. Something gentler than either of those. I thought about the man he had been before he became the man he had been, and I thought about the man he might still become if he chose to do the work. I thought about the apartment on the west side of Asheville with the warm yellow window and the shadow moving behind the curtain. I thought about all the versions of a person that exist simultaneously inside the person, you know, the best ones and the worst ones, and the ones that are still deciding which way to go. I was his father. That did not change because of what he had done. It did not become conditional on his behavior or dependent on his choices. It was simply true the way the cabin was simply true, the way the lake was simply true, the way the stone fire ring that my father had laid in 1963 was simply true. It was a fact about the world that existed independent of everything else. I would be here when he was ready, and if he was never ready, I would be here for that too. The fire had burned down to a bed of deep orange coals that pulsed slowly in the light wind coming off the water. Lily had gone completely still against my side, her breathing so slow, and even that I had checked twice in the past half hour to make sure she was merely sleeping, and not something more permanent, which is a thing grandparents do and will continue doing regardless of how irrational it is. Clara was looking at the water. "Do you hear that?" she said quietly. I listened. From somewhere out on the lake, far out near the center where the water was deepest, came the sound I had been listening for since we sat down. A long, wavering call that rose and fell and rose again, carrying across the still water with a clarity that made it seem closer than it was. Then a second voice joined the first, slightly lower, the two calls weaving around each other in the way they did two separate things, making one sound. The loons. Clara turned to look at me, and her face in the dying firelight was very young and very open, and very much the face of someone who has just heard something that reminds them why the world is worth the trouble it puts you through. "Helen used to say that the sound was the lake talking," I said. "What does it say?" Clara asked. I looked out at the dark water where the loons were calling to each other in the October night, their voices carrying across everything that had happened, and everything that had not happened, and everything that was still in the process of becoming what it was going to be. "It says we're still here," I said. "That's all. We're still here." Lily stirred against my side. She did not wake, but she tightened her small arms around my waist in her sleep, the way children hold on to things they love, without knowing they are doing it. "I have told you this family story, not because I am proud of every part of it, but because I think it deserves to be told honestly. If I am being truthful with myself, I was not always the man this story makes me sound like. I have made my own mistakes. I have chosen silence when I should have spoken, and spoken when I should have chosen silence. I have loved people imperfectly and expected perfection in return. So when I tell you, do not do what Julian did, please understand that I am also saying, do not do what I have done in my quieter, less dramatic failures either. The betrayals that destroy families are not always as visible as $60,000 on a bank statement. Sometimes they are smaller. Sometimes they are 1,000 small moments of not showing up fully for the people who needed you there. What I know after everything this family story has put us through is this: the truth is not your enemy. Hiding from it is. I believe, and I have believed since I was young enough to first understand it, that God does not give us more than we can carry. He gave me this. I carried it. And on the other side of it, there is a 7-year-old girl who builds fires the right way and asks excellent questions about loons. That is enough. That has always been enough. If these grandpa stories have meant something to you, today share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. And if you want more grandpa stories and family story content that makes you think, feel, and maybe call someone you love, subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. And one final note, the stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If that is not the content for you, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what serves you better. But for those of you still here, I will see you in the next one.